There are deaths that happen, and there are deaths that arrive as if they were waiting their turn. Before midnight, the Vane residence belonged to polished surfaces and controlled light. The drawing rooms held their silence like a social skill. Crystal caught the lamps softly. Portraits watched from gilt frames with the bored confidence of families that had survived too much by ensuring the record favored them. Beyond the winter garden, the city lowered itself into fog, while inside, under a brass reading lamp in the upstairs study, Helen Marr wrote murder for a living. She was 57, elegant, celebrated, and richer than most grief ever allowed itself to imagine. Critics praised her crime novels for their precision. Interviewers admired her restraint. Hostesses called her fascinating, in the careful tone reserved for women whose sadness had been made decorative by money. 5 and 20 years earlier, she had vanished abroad after a public collapse. 5 years after that, she returned transformed, poised, widowed by a husband no one in town had ever met, and carrying a life story so polished it seemed less remembered than issued. Now she lived alone, except for servants who knew better than to ask questions. The first story appeared in her typewriter on a Monday morning. She had not written it. The page was already rolled into the carriage when she entered the study, cream paper under her usual ribbon, her machine waiting with the docile innocence of an object about to betray its owner. The text was short, elegant, and written in her unmistakable style. It described a grocer named Walter Finn walking out before dawn to the East Reservoir, slipping on black algae at the stone lip, and dying face down in water shallow enough to shame him before it drowned him. Helen knew Walter Finn. He was alive. She had seen him at luncheon on Saturday. Yet there he was on the page, rendered into death with the refined cruelty of good prose. She told herself it was fatigue. At 7:40 the telephone rang. Walter Finn had been found drowned in the East Reservoir. The police called it misadventure until the second piece appeared. That one described Sister Cora Wynne of St. Jude's School pausing in the heater loft before evening prayer while ancient dust, bad wiring, and one delayed spark conspired with old timber to do what guilt had long promised itself was impossible. Helen took the page straight to the fire grate and nearly fed it to the flames. Instead, she hesitated. As all frightened people hesitate before the final destruction of evidence they pray is only madness. By dusk, the convent roof had burned. Sister Cora was dead before the engines arrived. After the third story, Detective Nolan stopped treating coincidence as a respectable word. The third described chemist Julian Pike reaching for a bottle on the upper shelf while the loosened bracket beneath it finally gave way. The bottle shattered. The vapor rose. Pike died choking behind his own counter before anyone reached him. When news of that death reached the town, Nolan paid a visit to the Vales mansion and found Helen waiting in the study, composed in posture if not in spirit. He asked the sort of questions detectives ask when they are still pretending the world is ordinary. Where she had been the night before, whether she had known Pike well, whether Walter Finn or Sister Cora had ever visited the mansion. Helen answered carefully and gave him nothing she could not afford to give. But even while he spoke, she had the dreadful sensation that Nolan was less interested in her replies than in the tiny delays before them, as though he were listening for a second voice somewhere behind her own. For weeks now she had been waking with ink on her fingers, mud dried at the hem of her coat, and once, most horribly, blood on the inside cuff of a glove she did not remember wearing.
She had blamed nerves, then drink she had not consumed, then the old aristocratic refuge of the troubled rich, a discreet physician. But physicians cannot explain gravel in the bedroom or the smell of reservoir water in a locked car. After that, a dreadful fear crept into her, that she was not the novelist who imagined murders, but the woman who might be writing them ahead of time. She stopped sleeping properly. She sat wakeful until dawn beside the dead fireplace in her dressing gown, with both hands around a glass she never finished, certain that if she let herself drift under, she would rise elsewhere with another death already typed in her own clean hand. Yet sleep came in fragments, and in those fragments, another life began pressing upward. A silver cigarette case snapped shut in the dark. Rain on a bridge rail. A girl in a yellow coat turning her head into light. A man's voice, low and urgent, saying that Helen must never speak of this again if she wished her life to remain hers.
She did not know the girl. She did know the car. It was standing under canvas in the old garage, the one no servant touched without instruction. She had not driven it in years. Yet one morning she found fresh road grit caught in the tire grooves and damp on the passenger mat, as though the night itself had been riding beside her. Nolan returned the next day with a list of the dead and the first fact that tied them together beyond prose. Walter Fenn, Sister Cora Wynne, and Julian Pike had all been present at the county courthouse 35 years earlier on the same day. One had testified, one had signed a statement, one had served on the inquest panel. The case had involved a fatal road accident on Blackwater Bridge and the death of a 17-year-old factory girl named Clara Hadley. Helen said she had never heard the name, but when Nolan laid Clara's old photograph on the desk, Helen's whole body recoiled with the terrible certainty of a door recognizing its key. She went that evening to the newspaper archive beneath the Chronicle, where old clippings slept in twine-bound stacks and yellowed into brittle memory. There, under Blackwater Bridge/1947, she found the story at last. The article named the dead girl. It also named the driver cleared at inquiry, Helen Vane. For one impossible second, she thought the paper had made a mistake. Then she saw the courthouse photograph beneath the headline and knew the mistake had been hers all along. The face in the grainy image was younger, harder, still wearing privilege like an alibi, but it was her face before something in it had been smoothed, softened, and renamed. Memory did not return gently after that. It came like floodwater through a door left on one hinge too long. She had been Helen Vane, daughter of industrialist Amos Vane. She had driven drunk across Blackwater Bridge after a charity supper. Clara Hadley stepped from the bus lane into rain and yellow headlight. Helen hit her hard enough to throw her against the parapet. Clara died on the road, while men loyal to the Vane name closed ranks around the scene. Statements were corrected, times adjusted, testimony purchased. Walter, Cora, and Pike had each helped, in their respectable way, to turn the homicide into Clara's carelessness. Helen broke afterward, but not from remorse alone. She broke because she could not live with acquittal. So her father sent her abroad. There, in clinics too expensive to be called hospitals plainly, she was treated until memory lost its sharp edges and shame was taught to sleep under other names. By the time she returned, 5 years had passed. Helen Vane had been folded away. In her place stood Helen Marr, widow by invention, polished by therapy, and returned to wealth with a safer story arranged around her like silk. The marriage had never existed except where her physicians and her father needed it to exist. The widowhood was part shield, part sentence. And her writing, all those elegant murders, all those crafted revelations, had been permitted because fiction gave the buried self a place to breathe without seeming dangerous. That was the private delusion. The greater horror came a moment later. The dead were not random. The typed stories had been for every person who helped bury Clara Hadley. And there was one name left. Helen ran upstairs to her study. The fourth page was already waiting in the typewriter. It was not a story. It was a final chapter. It named not Helen Marr, but Helen Vane, and said she would die before dawn at Blackwater Bridge, the place where the town had first agreed to rename guilt and call the result mercy. It did not read like a prediction. It read like a correction, long delayed. That was when she understood the truth of the nights. No ghost had been writing. No outsider had entered the study. The woman who slept under the safe name and the woman who rose in darkness under the guilty one had been sharing the same body all along. Helen Marr wrote fiction by day. Helen Vane walked by night and completed the list. There was one chance left, and she took it. Not to save herself, but to keep the truth from being buried once more. She gathered the old clippings, the inquest summaries, the first 3 pages, and the 4th naming herself. Then she tied them with red string and addressed a packet to Nolan, with one note telling him to look beneath every corrected statement for the original carbon. At 3 a.m. she drove to Blackwater Bridge. The rain had returned. The parapet was slick, and at the center span, beneath the same lamp where Clara died, stood the girl in the yellow coat, exactly as Helen had last seen her, turned half sideways, patient, and not accusing in any simple earthly sense. Helen stepped from the car and understood finally that she had not been haunted by Clara alone. She had been haunted by the self that should have confessed. By dawn, the car was found against the parapet rail, with its door open to the river wind. Helen's body was recovered 2 miles downstream at noon. The packet reached Nolan before breakfast, and by evening the old inquest was no longer safely dead. Respectable names shook, families denied, clergymen remembered poorly. But the town, once given the carbon beneath the amended page, could no longer pretend the lie had not first been typed deliberately. For there are people who believe money can purchase silence, treatment, reinvention, and enough corrected statements to outlive what they have done. But guilt, when protected by power and buried under paperwork, does not disappear. It learns the route back through the night, through the record, and through the hand that thought itself cured, until at last it writes the only ending ever honestly deserved, and afterward quietly crawls back into the light beyond shadow.